Welcome to Sherlock Holmes Mystery. Step into the fog-draped streets of Victorian London where Holmes and Watson confront the eerie case of the man who was buried alive. Where are you listening from? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. In that murky interval between a London afternoon and its early winter night, when the lamps in Baker Street make timid islands upon the pavement, and the fog lies about them like a cat. Upon a hearth there came a rapping so peremptory at our door that Mrs. Hudson started, and I, who had just set down my teacup, found myself halfway to the landing before Holmes had stirred from his chair. He had been for some time in that attitude of listless repose, which always betokened a mind active beyond measure. Long limbs strung across the firelight, fingers steepled, and those hawk-like eyes half-shuttered against the dulling effects of ordinary existence. The violin lay near at hand, and a smudge of grey ash upon the rug told me that the cigarette had died there, rather than burned in his fingers, sign enough, to me, that something new was required to feed his relentless faculties. "Lestrade," he murmured, before the latch had fully turned. He steps on his right heel more heavily in wet weather, and I observed the patter outside. Inspector G. Lestrade of Scotland Yard entered without preamble, coated to the throat and glittering with damp, his narrow face sharpened by anxiety. "Mr. Holmes," said he, stripping off his gloves and scattering beads of rain upon the tiles, "this is one you will either relish or refuse on the instant. For my part, I would gladly have refused it at the outset, had there been anyone to hand it to." Holmes inclined his head but did not rise. "Dr. Watson is in our confidence," he said. "Pray proceed." Lestrade cast an uneasy glance in my direction. I have long since ceased to be offended by such looks at the outset of a case, and I believe Holmes took a hidden pleasure in them. Then, drawing a breath as one about to plunge into cold water, the inspector began. "At 6:30 of the clock this morning, Jeremiah Pike, the beadle of Jude's in Millbank, presented himself at the station in a state of agitation that verged upon delirium. He had ran, mind you, all the way from the churchyard in his Sunday boots to report that a grave had been opened in the night, the coffin burst, and the body, if there was one, vanished." Holmes's eyes, which had been fixed upon the fire, flicked to the inspector's face. "If," he repeated softly, "proceed, Lestrade. It was the grave of Mr. Percival Estcourt Ashdown, a gentleman of means who expired, as the certificate has it, 2 days prior Tuesday evening of an apoplexy at his house in Adelphi Terrace. The funeral was yesterday afternoon. Family, a few friends, the curate, everything in order. The coffin was interred in the south plot near the yew. The sexton filled the grave. Mr. Pike locked the little iron wicket as he always does." "Your beadle is an attentive man," Holmes observed. "Over-attentive, some would say," Lestrade returned, with a twitch at his mouth. "There have been 1 or 2 incidents of body-snatching in the outer parishes, and Pike has made it his mania to prowl. He swears he went the rounds at midnight and again at 3. Nothing amiss, save the fog. But at dawn Lestrade's hand, still half frozen, made a little involuntary gesture. At dawn he hears a sound. A tapping, Mr. Holmes. A tapping from under the earth. I confess that, despite the many peculiar happenings I have observed in company with my friend, a chill prickled at my scalp. Holmes's face, however, assumed that peculiar neutrality which, with him, denotes the quickening of every sense. "He called the sexton," Lestrade went on. "They fetched spades, and well, they had the grave open to the lid in 10 minutes. The wood was split from within, and the screws, those confounded coffin screws, were in their places, but strained and bent like fish hooks. The coffin was empty." "Empty," Holmes echoed. He had taken his cigarette case in hand, but left it unopened. "And there were marks?" "God help us. There were marks enough to turn a stout man's stomach," Lestrade said grimly. "Splinters like claws, the lining torn into ribbons, a smear here and there blood, I dare say under the nails of the wood, and this." From the inner pocket of his greatcoat he produced a small muslin bag. Within lay a crumpled scrap of stiff cream-laid paper, as might be cut from a gentleman's visiting card. On it, in a square black hand, was written, "I did warn you." Holmes reached for it without touching the muslin, held it near the lamplight, then farther away. "No signature," he said. No address. The cut is not even torn with the teeth? No. A clean blade. The ink? And the fibres, Watson? Your glass. I provided the lens from its accustomed place. Holmes examined the card, then the little bag itself, then returned both to Lestrade with an air of polite regret, as though a promising opera had concluded upon a false note. And Mr. Percival Estcourt Ashdown? Holmes asked as he sank back. Has he been found? Is he in his bed, much amused at our expense? Lestrade's reply was as swift as it was bleak. Not found, Mr. Holmes. Not in his house, nor anywhere that we have yet searched. The family is in a state, the servants hysterical, the newspapers well. I have kept it out of the morning editions, but by evening we shall have penny columns shrieking of vampires under Westminster. Holmes's mouth curved in the shadow of a smile. And the yard? Baffled. Lestrade said candidly, I do not mind confessing it within these four walls. We have examined the railings and the little gate. The lock is sound. The soil shows disturbance only in the one place, and the prints there were prints, of course, from the beadle and sexton, and, after that, from every fool who put his boot in, despite my orders, but before the rabble came, there was surprisingly little. It had rained, you see, a thin drizzle that pitted the topsoil but did not make mud of it. There is nothing, he checked himself short, as though he had nearly betrayed a theory. There is nothing, Mr. Holmes, he repeated, that I can set before a magistrate and keep a straight face. Holmes's eyes had returned to the fire, but I knew he was listening with that whole-souled attention which a huntsman gives to the rustle of the covert. Tell me of Mr. Ashdown, he said. We will not be misled by the grave until we know the man it was meant to hold. Lestrade consulted a small notebook. A gentleman of independent means, investments in shipping and rail, a widower these 5 years, a daughter Miss Alice Ashdown of marriageable age, a sister, Mrs. Eugenia Braddock, of Bayswater. There is also a man who calls himself a cousin, Mr. Lionel Quarles, a fellow with more whisker than sense, if you will have my opinion. The household at Adelphi Terrace comprises a butler of long service, a housekeeper, a valet, and 2 maids. The doctor, not our good Watson, alas, Holmes murmured. The doctor is a certain doctor, Horace Penrith, who signed the certificate. Lestrade glanced at me, not unkindly. You will forgive me, doctor, but Penrith is the sort that makes me uneasy. A fashionable fellow with diamond studs and a new brougham. He was called last week to attend Mr. Ashdown in an attack of indigestion, and was present on Tuesday when the fatal seizure took him off. He recommended a speedy burial, owing to, how did he put it, a disagreeable tendency to pulmonary congestion, which he fancied might give rise to talk. The undertaker complied. The family did not object. What else? Oh yes, Mr. Ashdown had recently altered his will. Holmes's fingers, which had lain like pale sticks upon the arm of his chair, began the soft drumming I have come to associate with the scent of the quarry. In whose favour? The daughter, Miss Alice chiefly, Lestrade said. There is a settlement for Mrs. Braddock, and some annuities. The cousin Mr. Quarles had expected more and received less. So far, all as you would anticipate. He made a little face. I feel a fool stating motives to you, Mr. Holmes, when the manner of the thing is beyond the reach of a penny dreadful. The manner, Holmes repeated, is the melody. The motives are the bass. One without the other makes poor music. We shall see the churchyard, Lestrade. Lestrade brightened, then hesitated. There is one more particular. I scarcely know whether to put it to you as a fact or an apparition. The sexton, an old fellow who has buried more Londoners than I have arrested, declares that, upon opening the grave, he found, near the foot of the coffin, a little drift of white sand as fine as sugar, and as dry as the counter at a grocer's. He swears it could not be the soil. Jude sits on good London clay through and through. I examined it myself. It is, as he says, white sand. Holmes, who had crossed to his chemical corner, paused with his hand upon a retort. White sand, he said softly. His gaze moved to the window pane where the fog pressed its colourless forehead, then back to Lestrade. "You have brought some?" Lestrade looked abashed. "I did not think it seemed so trivial." "Nothing is trivial," said Holmes sharply, and then, the edge softening, "But you shall remedy the omission. Watson and I will be at Jude's within the hour. Meanwhile, not a word to the press. If they must have a headline, give them one that shouts and says nothing. Strange occurrence in Millbank police investigate. It will keep the public fed without swelling their fancies." He turned to me with that half-playful tyranny which I have never resented. "Your boots, Watson, the ones with the commando soles you obtained in Afghanistan." "Oh, I forgot. You left those there. The stout ones will serve. Bring your bag. A grave, even a disturbed one, may offer occupation for a medical man." As we made ready, Holmes shrugging into his long, smoke-scented ulster, I securing my instruments I could not chase from my mind. The image Lestrade's words had conjured. A black box beneath the damp earth, the air thinning to a knife edge, a human hand driving splinters from within, and, upon the lid of that prison, a neat little card that read, "I did warn you. If it were a prank, it was infernal. If not, then London had bred a horror that would set every bereaved family to tearing open graves." Yet even in that shuddering fancy there was comfort, for on the occasions, when I have been most chilled by the unknown, I have found Holmes most alive. He thrives, as the sailor thrives upon a gale, when ordinary men would turn for harbour. "Come, Watson," he said, with a briskness that dispersed my gloom. "We are to listen to the earth itself." It was a peculiar journey. The cab rattled us westward. The windows filmed by the breath of the fog and the lamps outside turned to mournful stars. At intervals Holmes would touch my sleeve lightly and incline his head, listening not to me, nor to the rumble of the wheels, but to some interior cadence that only he could hear. Once he chuckled, once he frowned, and once he drew from his pocket the card Lestrade had shown and held it flat against the window, as if the light might render visible some watermark or invisible script. He said nothing. I knew better than to press him. Speech, with Holmes, must be awaited rather than compelled. Jude's proved to be one of those dingy, respectable churches that squat between the river's breadth and the dwellings of clerks square-towered, with a stony yard hemmed by railings as black as a hearse. A small crowd had already gathered. Lestrade's constables kept them at a distance with praiseworthy patience. Within the gate the grass was a darker green than I had expected, for the fog seems to water it, and among the stones yawned a raw wound that showed the clay's reddish grin. Lestrade met us, cap pulled low. "I kept it as you asked," he said. "No one has touched it since we covered it after the morning. I have the coffin lid in the vestry." "Excellent," Holmes returned. He did not, however, go at once to the vestry. Instead he stood, eyes half closed, drawing in a breath through his nostrils like a hound testing the wind. He stepped to the grave's edge, and I saw, as he did, that the earth at the head had collapsed into the opening where the coffin had been, while at the foot it was still smooth and tamped. Holmes crouched. The fog filmed his hair, and his long fingers brushed the earth with a tenderness almost affectionate. "Watson," he said, and there was that note which means business. "Your lens." I handed it to him, and he leaned, peering at a minute crescent near the foot of the grave where the clay gave way to something paler. He touched it, brought his finger to his lip with a professional abstraction, and then, with a small sound of satisfaction, he removed from his pocket a narrow envelope, and using the blade of his penknife, coaxed into it a pinch of the pale substance. "Sand," he said, "but not the Thameside grit, nor the builder's sharp. This is finer an enemy of clocks and a friend of hourglasses. Note it, Watson. Note it particularly." Behind us, the bells of some distant steamer moaned upon the river. A woman in the crowd crossed herself. Lestrade, whose courage is not of the sentimental variety, swallowed. "Well," he prompted, "what in heaven's name does sand have to do with a gentleman clawing his way out of a coffin?" Holmes straightened, and for a moment his thin face was lit from within by that fierce joy which is his alone. "If heaven will have nothing to do with it," he said, "be assured the earth has everything. Come, let us see the lid." And thus, with the fog at our backs and the grave yawning like a question, we went in to view the splintered wood that had spoken before dawn, and told a tale that no man present cared to hear. The vestry smelt of damp stone and candle wax. On 2 trestles lay the coffin lid, its satin shredded, its oak ripped in a cruel crescent toward the foot. Holmes circled it, pausing for a fibre, then a stain, mastering each part before the whole. "Note the screws, Watson," he said. "They were not withdrawn. The slots are burred by pressure. The strain began at the foot, not the shoulders. If a man within had burst it, he would drive up centrally." Lestrade hugged his coat. "Then, someone from above?" Holmes set my fingers on the split. The grain lifted into tiny barbs. Levered. "See these 3 shallow bites on the inner oak teeth of a narrow iron. A spade could not pass. The tool was slender and oiled. Smell." I did so, and caught a stale, greasy odour. "Machine oil," Holmes said. "From a shop where small parts turn, and the lining?" He teased free a thread. "Horsehair, scented with turpentine and benzoin. Undertaker's preparation. Innocent." He bent so the lamplight slid along the varnish. A hairline groove, scarcely a scratch, ran from head nearly to foot. A fine saw worked from without, stopping where the wood yielded. An old resurrectionist device, revived. Lestrade brightened grimly. "Then it is no ghost. The body was cut out." "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Yet resurrection men are coarse. They do not fold satin so quietly." He smoothed the rucked lining, where creases ran in tidy fans, as though a mindful palm had, and pressed them. "Whoever opened this feared noise." And here, he drew from the hinge edge a pale grit and let it sift upon the lid. "Our white sand has travelled." He pocketed a pinch. "We have heard what the earth can tell us. Now we must hear the house." Fog thickened as our cab turned into Adelphi Terrace. The Ashdown house showed 3 lights. We were received by a gaunt butler, Cope, who led us to a morning room of prettiness. Miss Alice Ashdown stood by the fire. Beside her, Mrs. Eugenia Braddock arranged a paper knife. A gentleman lounged. Lionel Quarles. Holmes bowed. "We intrude upon grief, yet delay breeds harm. Permit a few plain questions." "If they lead to my father, sir, ask them all," said Miss Ashdown. "On Tuesday evening, who summoned Dr. Penrith?" "I did." "My father complained of pressure at the brow. Dr. Penrith had treated him for indigestion. Did Mr. Ashdown express any fear, any phrase you recall?" "He said he dreaded sleep." "He said he had been warned. By whom?" Mrs. Braddock answered quickly. "An anonymous letter last week. It advised my brother to put his papers in order and ended with the words found at the grave. He burned it." Quarles laughed without mirth. "A gutter snipe's joke." Holmes's notice moved to the writing desk. Upon the blotter lay a shallow oval of pale granules, like spilt sugar. He traced it with a finger. "Cope," he said, still looking at the desk. "Is there an hourglass here?" The butler started. "An hourglass, sir? Only the clock." He indicated a French timepiece beneath a glass dome. Within the base, a compartment of fine sand showed emptying where a rim was smeared. "Thank you, Doctor. Penrith is in the house?" "Not at present," said Miss Ashdown. "He calls again at 9. "Good. Before he returns, indulge me with a brief survey." Holmes moved mantel, grate, window-sill. From the ashpan he lifted a half-burnt corner of stiff card. The fire had spared 2 words, "warn you." He set it by the sand and said nothing. Lestrade re-entered. No callers since morning, save the vicar and a messenger from Penrith with a note. Holmes held out his hand. He read the note and passed it to me. Penrith regretted delay with a patient in Bloomsbury and would attend at 9 precisely. He stood, head aside. "Miss Ashdown, your father's bedchamber, if you please." She led us upstairs. On the landing, a draught shuffled a ring of pale grit from the joint where threshold met carpet. Holmes touched it and glanced at the keyhole. The smile that came had steel. "Watson," he murmured, "we are near the hinge of the matter. You will observe, you will not yet conclude." The air in Mr. Ashdown's bedchamber held a faint sweetness. The cloying scent of violet powder laid over something metallic and faintly acrid, the unmistakable trace of chemical preservative. The curtains were drawn tight, the lamp low, casting a steady amber glow that fell upon the wide four-poster bed where the coverlet was turned back neatly, as though awaiting its occupant. Holmes halted on the threshold, his nostrils flaring slightly as his gaze swept the room. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The bed has been remade, though the body departed only yesterday morning. No impression remains upon the pillow. The housekeeper's sense of order exceeds her discretion." He crossed to the bedside table where a decanter stood, half filled with some dark cordial, and beside it, a tumbler ringed faintly with residue. A small spoon lay on the tray, its bowl bearing a fine white dust. Holmes examined it under the lamplight. "Chloral hydrate," he murmured. "Common enough in the physician's trade, though one wonders why it sits beside a man dead of apoplexy." Lestrade came nearer, frowning. "Dr. Penrith prescribed it, perhaps for sleep? Possibly, but I observe that only 1 teaspoonful has been taken. A draught intended for the night should leave a stronger trace. And yet here," Holmes leaned closer to the rim of the tumbler, "a distinct film. The liquid was poured, then discarded. Someone wished to seem to follow the prescription without doing so." He straightened and moved to the hearth, where the last ashes of a fire lay pale and dry. With his cane, he gently parted the embers, uncovering a slender curl of stiffened paper. He lifted it with the point of his penknife and blew the ash clear. The fragment showed the upper corner of a visiting card, embossed in gilt. "Dr. Horace Penrith, Harley Street." "Watson," Holmes said softly. "A physician rarely burns his own card in a patient's grate. Unless, of course, he had given it to that patient with something else attached. Something that might have betrayed him." Lestrade scowled. "Then you suspect the doctor?" "I suspect only that he knows more than he will tell at 9 o'clock, Holmes replied. "But let us continue our inventory before the hour grows late." He moved methodically through the chamber, pausing at the writing desk. A small blotting pad lay there, the ink still fresh. Holmes turned it over, then held a sheet of clean paper upon the underside, pressing lightly with his fingers. Words emerged in mirror relief. I leaned closer, reading aloud. "If the hourglass runs empty, I am lost. If not, she is." There was no signature. Holmes regarded the impression with narrowed eyes. "A man in the grip of fear writes thus," he said. "But which she? His daughter or his sister? Or some third woman unseen?" Miss Ashdown, who had followed us timidly into the doorway, paled. "My father," he often said strange things these last weeks. He spoke of being buried before his time. I thought it was but a morbid fancy he had such thoughts at night. Holmes turned to her gently. "Did he ever mention an hourglass in that connection?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He kept one one on his desk in the library. He said it was a family piece, brought from Egypt long ago." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Egypt, you say?" "Yes." The sand within was pale as snow. He said it ran too quickly, as though the minutes escaped faster than they ought. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "White sand," he murmured. "Everywhere the same signature." A sharp rap echoed from the floor below. Cope appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Penrith has arrived, sir." "Excellent," Holmes said. "Show him up." Moments later, the doctor entered, a tall man, fashionably dressed, his dark beard trimmed to precision, his eyes keen yet guarded. He bowed politely. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade, Miss Ashdown. I was informed my assistance might again be required." Holmes regarded him without expression. "Indeed, Doctor, we have been examining your late patient's chamber. You attended him on Tuesday night?" "I did," Penrith replied smoothly. Mr. Ashdown was seized with sudden convulsions. Despite every effort, he succumbed within minutes. There was no cause for suspicion. His heart was sound as a bell, Holmes interrupted quietly. "The post-mortem appearance suggests neither apoplexy nor cardiac rupture." The physician stiffened. "I beg your pardon." Holmes's tone remained courteous. "I speak only as an observer of detail. For example, the presence of chemical traces foreign to a natural seizure, residues consistent with chloral hydrate, and perhaps something else." He turned the spoon in his fingers so that its surface caught the lamplight. "You will admit this bears your preparation." Penrith's lips tightened. "I prescribed it," Yes, to ease restlessness. Mr. Ashdown was troubled. He feared burial alive, absurdly enough. I assured him the drug would induce tranquil sleep. Indeed, said Holmes, so tranquil that he never woke. I resent the implication, the doctor snapped, colour rising in his cheeks. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Resentment often precedes revelation. Pray, doctor, will you join us downstairs? I should like to see the library, the one with the Egyptian hourglass. The doctor hesitated only a second, then smiled faintly. As you wish, Mr. Holmes. But I warn you, you chase shadows. Mr. Ashdown is beyond your help or mine. Holmes looked at him keenly. On the contrary, doctor, he said, I fear Mr. Ashdown may be closer to us than you imagine. The descent to the library felt like a slow plunge into some deeper undercurrent of unease. Holmes went first, the lamplight glinting off his sharp profile. Dr. Penrith followed, his composure perfectly restored, though his fingers worried at the gold chain of his watch as we moved. The others remained above, and when we entered the room below, only the clock's slow tick broke the hush. The Ashdown Library was an austere chamber, oak-lined and orderly, its shelves gleaming under, decades of polish. Upon the central desk stood the object we had come to see, an hourglass of curious design. Its twin bulbs were of smoky glass mounted in brass claws, and within drifted a fine white sand that shimmered faintly under the lamplight. Holmes approached it with the reverence of a naturalist confronted with an unfamiliar specimen. He examined first the rim, then the base, where a small keyhole gleamed like a pupil. A lock, he murmured, and then to Penrith, this mechanism is hardly decorative. Penrith gave a constrained smile. Mr. Ashdown claimed it held a secret compartment. He said it contained a reminder of mortality, though I took it as eccentric whimsy. I never saw him unlock it. Holmes's long fingers turned the hourglass delicately, and I saw that a faint residue of dust white, unmistakably the same as that at the grave, had settled about its foot. He unwrapped a small envelope from his pocket and compared the samples under the lamplight. Identical, he whispered. The same sand that lay beneath the coffin. Lestrade bent low, frowning. Then the stuffs from this trinket? Holmes shook his head. From this or to this? The direction of travel is the problem. He crouched, bringing his face level with the keyhole. Watson, you recall my remarks about sawdust in the coffin grain? It was driven inward, not outward. The disturbance came from above, and here we have our conduit. Conduit, I repeated. Precisely. Holmes straightened, eyes alight. The sand is more than ornament. It is the residue of something that passed between grave and house. Lestrade gave a half-laugh. You'd have me believe this bauble was connected to the coffin? Not physically, perhaps, but symbolically, and that may serve our purpose just as well, Holmes replied. Mr. Ashdown was a man who believed himself marked by a warning. He changed his will, spoke of being buried alive, and surrounded himself with this curious emblem of mortality. Now consider, the same white sand appears at his grave, upon his desk, and upon his daughter's floor. Coincidence has been ruled a coward's refuge, Lestrade. He turned again to the physician. Tell me, doctor, you examined the body before burial? I did, Penrith said crisply. Death was unquestionable. And yet, Holmes said softly, you recommended an unusually swift interment. The doctor's gaze hardened. To prevent unseemly speculation, the man was well known. His family deserved dignity. Or perhaps, Holmes said, his voice barely more than a murmur, to prevent discovery. Penrith bristled. You go too far, sir. I have nothing to conceal. Holmes's smile was almost kind. Then you will not object if I open the hourglass. Penrith hesitated, just long enough for the silence to pulse between them. It is locked, he said at last. Then I shall unlock it. From his coat, Holmes produced a thin instrument, one of his infernal devices, and within seconds the mechanism yielded with a soft click. He lifted the brass cap, and for a heartbeat all seemed still. Then a faint hiss escaped the narrow seam as he tilted the glass aside. From the hollow base fell not more sand, but a folded scrap of paper, browned with age and brittle at the edges. Holmes unfolded it carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. I did warn you, he read aloud, but you would not listen. The debt is paid in sand. Lestrade gave a low whistle. The same words as on the card. Holmes nodded slowly. Indeed. And yet this was sealed long before the grave was disturbed. You see the oxidation at the fold, the brittleness. It has lain within for years, so our present tormentor merely echoes an old menace. He slipped the note into his pocket. Watson, observe that we tread upon inherited evil one that may have awakened again. At that instant, a sudden noise cut through the room, a dull, resonant knock from beneath the floorboards. We all froze. It came again. Thud, thud, deliberate, measured, impossibly near. Penrith's face turned the colour of parchment. "It's the pipes," he stammered. "The heating." Holmes silenced him with a gesture. He stooped, ear near the rug. The knocking ceased, then resumed, this time fainter, as though retreating into distance. "Pipes do not recede," Holmes murmured. "They either burst or sing. This was neither." He rose swiftly. "Lestrade, your men are outside?" "Aye." "Have them circle the foundation. There's a coal cellar beneath this floor, is there not?" "Yes," said Penrith. "The entrance is in the rear passage." Holmes was already moving. "Then, gentlemen, let us see whether the dead have returned home or whether someone took pains to make us think so." The air grew colder as we descended the narrow stair to the basement, the flicker of Lestrade's lantern throwing long shadows against the damp brick. Holmes paused before the cellar door, listening. Then, without warning, he thrust it open. The beam of light struck a figure crouched amid the coal dust. A man, pale, gaunt, eyes wide as if newly wakened from the grave. He threw up an arm against the glare, and his voice, hoarse but alive, broke the silence with one ghastly phrase. "For God's sake, shut it again, the earth is still in my mouth." For a long, dreadful moment, none of us moved. The flickering lantern cast grotesque shapes upon the cellar walls, and the figure before us crouched like a creature half-born from nightmare, his skin chalk-white beneath streaks of damp earth, his clothes stiff with clotted soil, his hands trembling as though they still sought to claw through the darkness that had confined him. The air reeked of mould and stale air, and through that fetid breath came the unmistakable sound of a living man gasping. Holmes was the first to recover. With 2 swift strides he was beside the stranger, lowering the lantern to the ground. "Watson," he said quietly, "your flask, quickly." I obeyed, kneeling at the man's side. He took the brandy greedily, choking as it burned down, then drew in a long, shuddering breath that seemed to rake his entire frame. The wildness in his eyes gave way to confusion. "Mr. Ashdown," Holmes said softly, "you have been long in darkness. You are safe now." The name struck Lestrade as a blow. Ashdown? Good Lord, it is him! The man before us, what was left of him, closed his eyes as though in pain. "They buried me," he whispered. I heard the earth fall. Then the tapping. Oh dear heaven, the tapping. Holmes motioned for silence. "Steady, sir. You are among friends. Tell us only what you can bear. How did you come here?" Ashdown's head moved weakly from side to side. "The Dr. Penrith, he came after dark. Said there was danger, poison," he said, "that my food had been tainted. He gave me something to make me sleep to appear dead, he said, until he could prove the truth. But when I woke, it was night, and I could not move. The coffin," his voice broke into a strangled sob. "There was no air, no light, only the sound of my own nails. I must have torn through the side gave way. Then there was sand, white sand, pouring about me. I crawled until the earth opened." Holmes's expression did not change, but the gleam in his eyes sharpened. "You escaped through the soil itself?" "Through a hole fresh dug, someone had been there before. I think I fell through into a tunnel. I crawled until the air was clearer. Then the sound above, voices in the house, and I found the stairs. But it was locked." Holmes stood, his face now composed in that mask of absolute concentration I had seen only when the game was at its most perilous. "Watson, attend to him. Lestrade see that the man is guarded, but not confined. He must not leave this house, yet he must rest. There is truth in his madness, though we must sift it gently." Lestrade nodded, though his face was pale. "And the doctor?" Holmes's gaze drifted upward, toward the floor above where Penrith still waited. "Ah, yes. the good physician. We carried Ashdown to the servants' room at Holmes's direction, where I tended to his hands shredded and bloodied by his escape, and forced upon him a draught to calm the trembling that still seized him at intervals. When I returned to the library, Holmes stood by the window, watching the fog curl against the glass like slow smoke. Penrith sat opposite him, motionless except for the tightening of his jaw. "You found something below?" the doctor asked evenly. "Indeed," Holmes said. "A most unexpected resurrection. It seems, Doctor, your patient is alive." For the first time, Penrith's composure faltered. "Alive." Holmes's tone was quiet, almost gentle. "Alive enough to accuse. He spoke your name." The doctor's face hardened again, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. "The man is delirious. I warned him against stimulants. His mind has always been fragile." Holmes moved closer, his shadow cutting across the lamplight. "And yet it was your hand that prescribed the draught that placed him in that coffin. Your own signature, I presume, upon the bottle marked chloral. I might believe you intended a temporary feint, but for one curiosity, the coffin's screws were not removed from within. The lid was cut from above. Someone anticipated his return to life, and ensured that escape was possible though not comfortable." Penrith's eyes flicked toward the door. "You accuse me of impossible contradictions. If I meant to murder him, why permit him any chance of escape?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because, Doctor, murder was not your object. You required only the appearance of death, a death you could control, long, enough to alter his affairs and extract your reward. But something went amiss. The buried man awakened before you were ready, and now your game lies in ruins." Penrith surged to his feet. "This is madness." "You have no proof." "On the contrary," Holmes replied softly, "I have both proof and pattern. The hourglass, the letter within it, and the sand that followed him from the grave all are instruments of your deception. The hourglass was the key to his delusion. You fed it to him an heirloom, a curse, a device to measure the moments of his doom until he believed himself pursued by time itself. When his will was changed, when the daughter's inheritance was secure and your name poised to control her fortune, you struck." Penrith's breath came quick and harsh. "And if I deny it?" Holmes stepped aside, his voice low and cutting. "Then we shall allow Mr. Ashdown to speak for himself at dawn, and if he does not, the evidence in that glass will do so for him." The doctor's gaze darted once more toward the door, and I saw Holmes's hand move fractionally to his pocket. But before he could act, Penrith turned abruptly, snatched the lantern from the table, and flung it hard against the window. Glass shattered, and a gust of cold air rushed in with the smoke. When the light cleared, the doctor was gone. For several moments the room was a chaos of noise and motion. The shards of glass still tinkled upon the floor, the curtains flapped wildly in the night wind, and Lestrade, cursing under his breath, made for the broken window. Holmes was faster. With a single bound he was upon the sill, the tails of his coat snapping like black wings as he leaned out into the fog. "He's taken the side lane toward the embankment," he called, and was gone before either of us could reach him. Lestrade and I followed as swiftly as the dark would permit. Outside, the fog had thickened into a living thing, an ashen veil that swirled and breathed around the lamplight, until even the cobbles seemed uncertain beneath our feet. Somewhere ahead came the echo of running steps. Holmes's voice rose briefly, then vanished into the murk. We reached the corner in time to see a glimmer of movement, a lantern swinging, the fleeting outline of a man forcing his way through the mist. Then came a sound that froze my blood, a cry of pain, sharp and sudden, followed by the hollow clang of metal striking stone. When we reached the spot, the fog parted just enough to reveal Holmes crouched beside the prone figure of Dr. Penrith. The doctor lay half across the iron grating of a coal chute, one arm twisted unnaturally beneath him. Holmes's hand was upon the man's wrist. "He lives," Holmes said quietly, though his escape was ill-calculated. Lestrade knelt beside him. "A fall?" "Precisely." The grating gave way. "Fortune, for once, aligns with justice." Holmes rose, his face pale but composed. "We shall have him conveyed to the yard, Lestrade, and placed under guard until Mr. Ashdown is strong enough to testify. The man will recover. He has the constitution of one who has long thrived upon deceit. By the time we returned to Adelphi Terrace, the first faint greying of dawn had begun to stir above the river. The fog hung lower now, settling into the streets like weary breath, and the house stood in a silence that felt heavier than before. Mrs. Braddock and Miss Ashdown waited in the drawing room, their eyes searching ours as we entered. Holmes bowed slightly. "Your physician, ladies, has met with an unfortunate accident, one which will render him unable to trouble you further for the present." Miss Ashdown clasped her hands to her lips. "Then it was true he harmed my father?" Holmes's expression softened. "It is more complex than mere harm. He sought to feign death, not cause it, yet greed is an unsteady ally. He hoped to manipulate your father's fear to his own advantage, and when events turned against him, he allowed panic to guide his hand. The drug he administered was meant to simulate the stillness of the grave, but its strength was near fatal. Had not Miss Ashdown revived by some miracle of constitution, or, I might say, of providence, his fate would indeed have been sealed beneath the earth." She trembled. "But why? Why would my father trust such a man?" "Because fear is the oldest instrument of persuasion," Holmes said. "Your father's mind had been weakened by anxiety. The anonymous letter, the hourglass, the talk of sand, all these were calculated to sustain his dread. The doctor knew his patient's obsession and used it. Once the will was changed, it was only a matter of hastening what seemed inevitable." Lestrade, standing near the mantel, gave a low whistle. "A devil's business, and cleverer than most. He'd have made a fortune had the dead stayed buried." Holmes's eyes glinted faintly. "Fortune seldom stays long with the faithless, Inspector." He turned to the window where the pale light crept between the curtains. "And yet, one question remains unanswered." "What question?" I asked. "The white sand," Holmes replied. "Penrith used it as symbol and substance both, but it was not of local origin. He did not fetch it from the Thames, nor from any builder's yard. He claimed it came from Egypt, through the Ashdown heirloom, but the samples differ subtly. This is purer, finer, as though sifted through centuries. Why use it at all? Why import such a thing for a deception that could have succeeded without it?" Before I could answer, a weak voice came from the doorway. "Because he did not import it." We turned. Mr. Ashdown stood there, supported by Cope the butler, his face ghostly but his gaze lucid now. "The sand was already here beneath the house," he said. "My father told me once, long ago, that these walls were built upon the remains of an older dwelling, a merchant's storehouse from the days when the river came up to the terrace. When I was a boy, we found the sand in the cellar, after a flood fine and white as flour. He said it was ballast from ships that traded in the East." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ballast," he repeated softly. "Then the chain is complete." He stepped forward, taking Ashdown gently by the arm. "You have done more for justice tonight, sir, than you know. You have also confirmed the final link in a crime conceived with extraordinary cunning. The white sand was the doctor's tool, yes, but it was also his undoing. He thought it a prop in a drama of his own devising. In truth, it betrayed him at every turn." Ashdown's lips trembled into a faint smile. "Then it is finished?" Holmes's reply was quiet, but certain. "Finished for now. The law will claim its due, and you, sir, will sleep again, this time above the earth." As dawn spilled fully into the room, I saw him turn away from the window, with that peculiar stillness that follows his greatest exertions. The case, though not yet formally closed, was already folded within the chambers of his mind, to be examined and dismissed in silence. He looked toward me, a faint trace of weariness softening the keen lines of his face. "Watson," he said, "I have long maintained that fear is more contagious than disease. Yet, like disease, it may be cured by exposure to truth. It is the only inoculation worth administering." And with that, as the light strengthened and the sound of the city began to stir again, he turned back to the window and watched the river's pale mist unwind, as though the very soul of London were breathing itself awake. The morning light had fully claimed the city by the time we departed Adelphi Terrace. London, indifferent as ever to the tragedies of its citizens, was stirring to its usual pulse. The clatter of hooves, the calls of hawkers, the faint rumble of the river beneath the fog. Yet I could not shake the bees, sense that the night had left something unquiet behind it, a residue of dread, like the scent of damp earth clinging after rain. Holmes, seated opposite me in the cab, was silent save for the faint tapping of his fingers upon his knee, a rhythm as steady and inevitable as thought itself. At last he spoke. "Watson, have you ever reflected upon how often the dead refuse to remain decorously in their graves, not in body, but in consequence?" "I have seen more than one such instance in your company," I replied, attempting a smile. "Quite so," he murmured. "Yet this particular resurrection troubles me. You observed the man's condition. Not merely exhaustion or fright, but confusion, an interval of memory blotted clean, a mind drugged beyond ordinary purpose. The physician's hand may explain much, but not all. There remains that curious element of timing, the coincidence of his awakening with our visit to the grave. It is as though some external force disturbed the design." I frowned. "You think another hand was at work?" "I think," he said softly, "that our good doctor was not the sole architect of the play. His greed supplied the means, but someone else may have written the script." We reached Baker Street just as Mrs. Hudson appeared with her accustomed mixture of solicitude and disapproval, fussing over the mud on Holmes's boots and the soot upon my coat. Once we had refreshed ourselves, Holmes retreated immediately to his chemical corner, spreading before him the envelopes of white sand collected from the grave, the house, and the hourglass. The familiar scent of reagents filled the room, sharp and oddly invigorating after the stale air of the cellar. For an hour he worked in silence, moving with quick precision, heating, filtering, examining through his lens. I sat nearby, making my notes, until at last he gave a soft exclamation and straightened. "Watson, the sand tells a clearer story than its wielder ever could. Observe." He placed 3 slides upon the table. "Here is the sample from the grave note, the purity, the rounded grains, the absence of organic matter. Here, from the hourglass, similar, yet faintly tinged with mica, suggesting age. And here, from the Ashdown cellar courser, mixed with soot and fragments of shell. 3 variations of one origin, but the grave sand differs subtly. It contains traces of nitrate of mercury salts, to be exact. Tell me, what does that suggest?" I considered. "Mercury, embalming fluid, perhaps?" Holmes smiled faintly. "A good guess, but not quite. The compound occurs not in preservation but in illumination. Mercury nitrate is used in the manufacture of mirrors. Someone who works with such materials would find this substance familiar." "The doctor? Unlikely. His art is deception, not reflection. No, Watson, this points elsewhere, perhaps to one within the household. Perhaps not, but I will not speculate until I am sure. We must revisit Jude's." By midday we were again before the iron gates of the churchyard, now deserted save for a lone gravedigger patching the mound we had disturbed. Holmes spoke briefly with him, then descended into the open vault where the coffin had been reinterred. The damp air clung to us like breath from the earth itself. Holmes crouched, studying the walls. "There," he said at last, pointing to a faint silvery film upon the inner surface of the coffin lid. "Mercury vapour. It must have been painted within why, I cannot yet say, but see this indentation along the edge, as though a fine wire had been set between the planks. If my reasoning is correct, Mr. Ashdown's death was observed by means of reflection, an infernal contrivance indeed." He stood abruptly. "Watson, we return to the source. The coffin maker must be found." Within the hour, Holmes's inquiries had brought us to a small workshop in Clerkenwell, its sign reading T. W. Grimby and Sons, Coffin Makers and Funeral Appurtenances. The place was dim and smelled of varnish and pine. Behind the counter, a stooped old man emerged, wiping his hands upon an apron. Holmes addressed him with easy civility. "Good day, Mr. Grimby. I believe you supplied a coffin 2 nights past for a Mr. Percival Ashdown of Adelphi Terrace." The old man blinked. "Aye, sir. Fine gentleman. Dr. Penrith ordered it himself, paid cash. Unusual request, that one. Wanted a glass panel fitted under the lid, though he said it was for viewing at the funeral. I warned him it'd fog over soon as the earth took it." "Glass, you say?" Holmes repeated quietly. "Aye, sir. Thin as I could manage, sealed with mercury backing. Looked like a looking glass turned wrong way round. Odd notion, if you ask me." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, a looking glass to the grave. Tell me, Did the doctor collect it himself? No, sir, sent his man, tall fellow, foreign accent. Left no name. Paid. Proper, though. Holmes nodded, his voice even. Thank you, Mr. Grimby. You have rendered invaluable service to the living. Outside, as we turned into the street, I caught the light of satisfaction in his gaze. So, I said, the coffin was made not merely to hold a man, but to watch him. Precisely, Holmes replied. The question that remains is, who was watching? For the doctor's eyes alone could not have been enough. Someone else looked into that mirror. Watson and I fear they may not yet have closed it. The afternoon was waning when we returned to Baker Street, the murk of London pressing down like a closing lid. Holmes went directly to his chair and lit a cigarette, the smoke coiling upward in pale wreaths. He was not, as many might imagine, given to dramatics when nearing the end of a case. His excitement ran too deep for outward show, but there was a gleam in his eyes now, a light that burned with cold precision. Watson, he said, we have seen the instrument, but not the hand that guided it. Dr. Penrith was no craftsman of mirrors, no engineer of glass. He required assistance, someone who understood both the material and the means by which it could deceive. You believe this accomplice remains hidden? Hidden, perhaps, though not beyond reach. The foreign servant who fetched the coffin, a tall man, Grimby said. That detail is most instructive. Our friend Lestrade has already had Penrith conveyed to the yard. I shall request that his effects be examined. Meanwhile, we must consider who stood to gain most once the man was presumed dead. The daughter, I ventured. Holmes shook his head. No. Miss Ashdown's inheritance was secure already. The change in the will merely hastened what time would have granted. But the sister, Mrs. Braddock, there lies a more complex thread. Her annuity was modest, and she lives far beyond it. Her debts, I am told, are considerable, and, as you may recall, she was quick to speak of that letter, the one warning Mr. Ashdown to make his affairs ready, quick to remember, quick to divert suspicion. You think she sent the letter herself? I think she wrote it at another's dictation. A woman of society would scarcely procure mercury-backed glass from a coffin-maker, but she might know a man who could, a man of her acquaintance, a confidant, perhaps a foreign adventurer eager to share in her gain. At that instant, there came a knock upon the door. It was Lestrade, his expression taut with suppressed excitement. Found something, Mr. Holmes. Penrith's papers. Among them, a note in another hand, same writing as the warning card you saw. It bears only 3 words. The hour runs. And a name, Lionel Quarles. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Ah, our whiskered cousin. I thought we had not yet seen the last of him. He rose so abruptly that the cigarette fell unheeded to the floor. Watson, fetch your hat. The play is nearly done. If I mistake not, we shall find our tall foreign servant under a very English disguise. The fog had returned by the time we reached Bayswater. The Braddock residence loomed dimly through it, a square of yellow lamplight showing from an upper window. Holmes motioned for silence and led the way to the side entrance, where he produced a small key, a twin, I knew, to one he had taken from Penrith's pocket earlier. The lock yielded with scarcely a sound. Within, the house was unnervingly still. From above came faint movement, a murmur of voices. Holmes touched my arm, then began to ascend the stair, his steps soundless on the carpet. As we neared the landing, the voices grew distinct. Mrs. Braddock's tones, low and tremulous, were answered by a deeper one, unmistakably foreign. I tell you, it is over, the man was saying. He lives, and the doctor is taken. We must go now, before the police. Holmes pushed open the door. The man within sprang up, a tall, dark fellow whose beard had been hastily shorn, though the cut of his features betrayed him as the same I had glimpsed beside Miss Ashdown days before. Lionel Quarles no longer, but the accomplice unveiled. Mrs. Braddock gave a cry. Holmes advanced, calm and inexorable. You have been industrious, my dear sir, he said, from coffin to cousin in a single masquerade. Yet your final illusion is broken. The mirror you built to watch the grave has turned, and now it reflects you. The man lunged toward the window, but Lestrade was already there. With a single swift motion, he drew the revolver from his coat. Enough theatre, the inspector said grimly. The curtain's down. Holmes stooped, retrieving from the table a small wooden box, the twin of the hourglass, sealed with a smear of white sand. "Watson," he murmured, "the last piece of our puzzle. And, I think, the proof that this conspiracy began long before Mr. Ashdown ever lay in his coffin." Holmes examined the small wooden box with the care of a jeweller assessing a rare stone. It was of polished ebony, its hinges worn, the lock crudely forced. Within, cushioned on folds of black velvet, lay a second hourglass smaller than the first, yet unmistakably of the same design. The white sand within shimmered faintly, as though it caught some secret light of its own. Mrs. Braddock, pale and trembling, sank into a chair. "I know nothing of that," she said weakly. He brought it here. He said it was only to frighten my brother, not to harm him. I never meant." Holmes silenced her with a glance, then turned to the man still pinned by Lestrade's revolver. "You are not Lionel Quarles," he said coldly. "You assumed his name, as you assumed your employer's trust. The real Quarles vanished months ago, you're doing, no doubt. You replaced him neatly, even to the beard, and under that disguise, you found means to seduce a desperate woman into your scheme." The man's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Holmes went on, his tone precise, almost surgical. "You met Penrith through Mrs. Braddock. The doctor's debts and your ingenuity formed a perfect alliance. You conceived the notion of a simulated death, an old charlatan's trick revived for modern greed. The coffin, with its mirrored panel, allowed you to observe your victim's stupor, ensuring the illusion held, but you misjudged your chemistry. The drug's effect wore thin too soon. Ashdown awoke, and the earth that should have sealed his silence became the path of his escape." Holmes held up the hourglass. "And this? The final flourish. A duplicate, planted here to perpetuate the delusion. I dare say it was to be found after Penrith's return, a symbol to justify whatever inheritance you and your accomplice hoped to control." Lestrade cuffed the man's wrists as he made a sudden motion toward the table. "You'll speak your answers at the yard, not here," the inspector said curtly. "There's enough to hang the pair of you twice over." But Holmes's eyes were upon the hourglass. With careful fingers, he prized the brass rim loose. A hiss escaped, faint yet distinct. From a cavity within fell a thin roll of parchment. He uncurled it slowly, and I saw, written in faded ink, the same phrase that had haunted the case from its beginning. "I did warn you." Beneath it, another hand had added a line. "The hour runs for all who break the trust of the dead." Mrs. Braddock let out a strangled gasp. That is my father's handwriting." Holmes's expression softened, though his voice remained grave. "So it seems, the warning you thought devised by your conspirators was older than their crime. It came from your own family's history, revived by those who found it convenient to cloak their villainy in superstition." He turned the parchment so the faint seal could be seen. "This was written more than 20 years ago. Your father, it appears, feared a betrayal even then, perhaps by some earlier hand in business or blood. It is ironic that his words, preserved in this bauble, should rise now to ensnare his betrayers anew." For a moment, silence claimed the room. The fog pressed at the window panes, and the steady tick of the mantel clock sounded like the measured fall of sand. Then Lestrade gave a short, practical nod. "Well, that's a tale for the judge. My men will see them both to the yard. You'll have your proofs, Mr. Holmes." "The woman's guilt is moral, not mortal. The man's is both." When they were gone, Holmes stood for a long while, the hourglass still in his hands. The last grains of sand slipped through the narrow neck and gathered quietly in the lower bulb. "Curious," he murmured. "A man builds a device to measure time, and in the end, it measures conscience instead." He looked toward me with that half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Come, Watson, let us return home. There remains the simple task of setting the record in order, and perhaps, before the evening grows late, a pot of coffee to chase away the scent of grave dust." As we stepped out into the street, the fog began to lift, and for the first time in many hours, the light of day seemed clean again. Yet behind us, in the silent house, the faint echo of falling sand seemed to whisper that time, once measured, never truly stops. The carriage wheels hummed steadily along the damp road as we returned once more to Baker Street. Holmes sat opposite me, hat pulled low, the newly discovered hourglass glinting faintly in his gloved hands. Though the case had reached its conclusion in the eyes of the law, I could tell his mind was still spinning through its unseen depths. There was something unfinished, a note in the melody not yet resolved. At last he spoke, his voice low, as if half to himself. "It is a rare thing, Watson, to find a crime that begins in superstition and ends in science. These villains mistook symbol for power. They toyed with the fears of the living and the dead alike, and it was their undoing. But there remains one question that I cannot yet answer." I leaned forward. "What question is that, Holmes?" He held up the second hourglass. "This. It is no mere ornament. Its construction is far beyond a craftsman's whim. The mercury seal, the fine tubing, even the weight of the sand, there is method here, not chance. Someone devised these things long before Penrith and his accomplice used them. I suspect the doctor stumbled upon an older device and merely repurposed it." "An older device? For what purpose?" He smiled faintly. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely the mystery. It may have been intended for hypnotic study, or even a means of observing cataleptic states. Its origin may lie in that curious frontier between science and charlatanry, where reason wears the mask of the occult. You see now why I do not rest easily until every shadow is accounted for." I nodded, though a chill passed through me at the thought. "Then you think others might possess such instruments?" "I think," said Holmes, setting the hourglass carefully upon the table, "that time is never the only thing measured by sand." He rose and went to the window. Outside, the fog had thinned to a pale gauze, through which the lamps shone like fading embers. "You recall the inscription, 'The hour runs for all who break the trust of the dead.' There is irony there, but also warning. Mr. Ashdown's family built their fortune on ship ballast, on trade and risk. They disturbed the resting sands of other shores, and in turn those sands returned to trouble their own house. A moral symmetry, Watson, unintended but exquisite." I smiled at his tone. "You make it sound as though Providence itself lent a hand." Holmes turned from the window, the ghost of amusement playing about his lips. "Providence, or chemistry. I confess I find both equally compelling when properly employed." Just then, there came a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson appeared bearing a telegram. Holmes tore it open, scanning its contents swiftly. "Ah, Lestrade," he said. "Our friend Penrith has made a full confession. He claims the foreigner, our false cousin, brought him the design of the mirrored coffin, saying it was based on an Eastern apparatus used to test whether trance resembled death. The doctor, ambitious fool, thought to profit by demonstrating it upon a living subject, a grotesque vanity disguised as science. He dropped the telegram into the fire and watched it curl to ash. So, you see, the case resolves itself neatly at last, yet I find little satisfaction in it. The triumph belongs to circumstance rather than intellect." "That's not how I should record it," I said warmly. "You saw through every layer, each deceit, each motive, until the truth was bare." Holmes regarded me with that curious expression of mingled humour and affection I had learned to value. "Ah, Watson, your loyalty blinds you to proportion. The world is full of puzzles far more intricate than this. A man buried alive is sensational. A man buried by his own deceit inevitable." He picked up the violin that rested by the hearth and drew the bow across the strings. The first notes were low, wandering, like the murmur of the river through mist. "Come, my dear fellow," he said softly. "Let us not dwell upon graves. There will be another problem soon enough, and London has a habit of keeping us employed." As the melancholy strain filled the room, I leaned back in my chair, watching the firelight flicker against the window pane. Outside, the dawn wind stirred the fog into motion once more, and I thought perhaps fancifully that for one fleeting instant, the grains of time in some invisible glass had turned again, beginning their descent toward the next mystery that awaited Sherlock Holmes.